Well, you just told us some of the things that you have learned during your recent adventures. What do you think the voters have learned, if anything, and what have we as a state been unable or unwilling to learn?
Well, I think the most interesting thing, again, when I talk to professional people, whether it's you, Bob, whether it's my friends at Citizens Budget Commission, whether it's other academics who've studied this, EJ's analyses of problems, and I wonder why nothing changed in the politics. And the answer is public's behavior hasn't changed. The unions have not changed their behavior in terms of their ability, and not improperly, this is not a criticism, their right to use their money and their influence to petition the political governmental system to get what they want. And correspondingly, the banks haven't modified their behavior. They are up here peddling the same cockamamie borrowing schemes that help get us into trouble. They're doing that all over. What is interesting is that the media outlets that are on the political right just choose to talk about the alleged transgressions of the unions, and the left only wants to talk about the transgressions of the right. And there is not much of a middle anymore in the political discourse. So I don't think that until the public recognizes the seriousness of the problem, this fundamental imbalance, this looming nightmare of pension and healthcare obligations, until the public recognizes the seriousness of this, I don't think the political system is going to address it with the sense of urgency that they should. I worry about that a great deal because ultimately the greatest victim of all of this is the democratic political system. That's what the small d, obviously. That's what worries me the most. But so far, there's always been enough cash hanging around in one form or another. Either people's willingness to lend it no matter what, people's willingness to sweep out bank accounts, to make a payment that's due, to defer a payment from one year to the next because we don't have accrual accounting for budgeting purposes. And the only thing that matters is whether you have enough cash at any given moment in time to avert a catastrophe. That's how the government works, and that's how most state governments work. I don't mean to pick on my state, our state, which I love and committed to. I have a lot of children, stepchildren, grandchildren. We own a lot of homes in New York. Unfortunately, they all live in New York. So I have all kinds of personal as well as intellectual commitments to New York. But let me tell you about California. California, they have a system whereby, I'm sorry if I'm talking too much. That's what we're all here for. But in California, they have a system in which they give the payment of debt is a priority. In California, actually, the Constitution and statute say that the state must take its tax revenues, first spend them on K through 12 education. Very interesting. California is unique that way, but that's because of Prop 13, where they essentially made it impossible for local governments to finance K through 12 education. And second of all, they then have to pay the debt service on their notes and bonds. So there is very little chance that that money won't be paid. But when you read it the same week that California sold $6 billion of notes, that they also announced they had a $26 billion deficit, let me tell you what it means. It means that the University of California, which was once the greatest state university in the country, is being eviscerated, and that their faculty even their tenured faculty is being raided by private universities all over this country. It means that every other governmental service, every other public service or function that the government of the state of California performs is going to be severely, severely diminished. Some eliminated. I don't know the details. I'm going to go out and spend a few days in January because I'm curious to understand more about it. And of course, they have the same pension problems that every state has. So we're getting to a point where one of two things are going to happen. Either somebody's going to run out of cash, and then people will have to pay attention, or there will be such a significant diminution of public services that there will be a lot of discomfort in a growing percentage of the population. And I just want to say something about education. You know, because I come out of the business world primarily, and all my friends say, well, the only way out of this mess is economic development, economic growth. Well, I want to say, and it's not because I'm here with the Rockefeller Institute, this is very important. There are 3 kids in public universities throughout the United States for every one that is in a private university. And throughout this country, the tuition in public universities is rising. And because of the number of unemployed and the economy, the number of applicants to public universities is rising. Now, if anybody thinks that we can grow an economy as we diminish the resources for higher education in this country, then you've got another gas company. And that's my biggest long-term concern. Sorry, Bob.
Let me go back to what you were describing a few moments ago in terms of the political environment, and go further back to the 1970s when Governor Carey and others with significant work from you yourself did reverse the sorts of problems that we're looking at today. Has something changed since then that makes it more difficult to address these problems?
Yeah, well, first of all, the state wasn't in financial difficulty in 1975. The city was. Why was the city in trouble? Because they borrowed money that they didn't have the ability to repay. Sound familiar? But there was one big difference, and that is that under the law, the cities can file bankruptcy. So it was because of the threat of bankruptcy, the possibility of bankruptcy, and a threat which we didn't hesitate to exercise. The threat, not fortunately ever the deed, that everybody's behavior changed. The unions could not afford to take the risk that all collective bargaining agreements would have been abrogated. And the banks couldn't take a chance of a lot of litigation under the fraud provisions of the 34 securities law. So they did things like support a 3-year moratorium on the payment of interest, invested in the MAC bonds, which they didn't want to do initially. Unions agreed to wage freezes, deferrals, new pension tiers, all kinds of fundamental modifications in what had been a rapidly growing expense for public employees. All of this was negotiated. Everybody contributed to the solution. The taxpayer, the debt holder, and the public employee. But we had a trigger. We had the threat of something that was far worse, that enabled everybody to survive within their own constituencies, which is part of how the democracy works, and get things done. I also, as I've been quoted as saying, Hugh Carey was an exceptional man in many ways, and it was a hell of a lot easier
So we don't have a trigger in New York, we don't have a trigger in California. There are at least two potential triggers. One would be the federal government getting involved with the states more than it has been. The incoming governor says that he, as governor, will in effect be the trigger. Do you see the federal government playing more of a role in putting states back on the right path? And does the governor have the power to do that without being pushed from?
Well, they're very separate questions. I think that the federal government obviously is wrestling with their own version of the same conflict. Inadequate resources to meet obligations. And as we see, two deficit reduction commissions, one appointed by a group of ex-members of the Senate on a totally bipartisan basis, one appointed by the President, all people of great quality and integrity, and no consensus. And now a temporary agreement on extending a tax cut in exchange for unemployment benefits, which I think was personally a transaction of dubious merit, that doesn't solve the problem either, because the federal deficit is still going to grow until we tax more and or cut more at a federal level. So I don't think that there is any prospect, particularly given the mood of the public as reflected in last November's election. I don't think there's much prospect for any federal bailout of state pension funds. There are a lot of estimates of the underfunding of state pension funds, I think, and it all depends what is the right rate of return to subsume in computing that underfunding. But I would say that the most realistic estimates that I've read would say that the underfunding of state pension funds somewhere in the category of $3 trillion. And the idea that that is going to be bailed out by the feds is silly and naive. Whether at some point in the process the feds would contribute to a solution, I would hope so. I think what we need from the feds, almost anything, more importantly than anything else, is the imposition of discipline on the states. The government responded to what happened in 2008, whatever you want to call it. It wasn't a short-term recession, which most people choose to characterize it as. They responded with a lot of aid to states to cover education and health care costs, a larger federal pickup of Medicaid. But when that all comes to an end June 30th, this coming June 30th, the states are going to fall off a cliff fiscally. And I don't think they're going to replace it. So, one-shots, whether they're from the federal government, whether they're from a sale of assets disguised as privatizations, or whether it is from a one-time borrowing, like hypothecating the tobacco revenues, or some of the other schemes that are being considered. Those one-shots, that is not a sustainable course of action. So I think that one has to, every state is largely on its own body to try to address the seriousness of this problem. And I don't think it can be solved overnight. I think there has to be a transition period to get to real structural balance. And we may need federal help in financing that transition. But at the moment, everybody in Washington is concerned with other things and wishing all of us worried about state finances good luck, and don't call us, we'll call you.
And in terms of Governor-elect Cuomo's ability,
I hate to comment. I have not.
Well, you have said that the
Talk to
governor's powers
him.
ought to be expanded to deal with
Well, Bob, you and I have had a fascinating dialogue. I've learned a great deal from you. You've written extensively on the issue. And if I'm not saying this fairly, you please correct me. But the governmental system in New York doesn't work well without a strong government. There's no question about that. Under our Constitution and our budget practices, the governor has a lot of power and a lot of responsibility. Those of you who share the same concerns I have assume governors will use those powers to produce fiscal sense and fiscal balance. But if you look at the history of the last 20 years, every abuse, i.e. one shot that was used from the sale of Attica Prison to plug a budget hole, to the use of the money that came from the privatization of Blue Cross Blue Shield. If you look at the sweeping of all of the bank accounts, fiduciary accounts the states have, the tobacco securitization, other asset sales, other financings, one-shot financings, they were all initiated by the executive branch of Congress. And you can't lose sight of that as you try to balance these things. Now again, it is the very nature of democracy and of democratic politics that people want to do more for the people they represent. And fortunately, we've lived in a country and in a state that's been able to afford an ever-expanding level of benefits. But when our economic growth didn't keep pace with the social commitments that we wanted to make, or the commitments to the people who work in the public sector, we didn't stop when we should have stopped and said, hey, are we really creating a long-term financial burden that we do not have the capacity to meet? And now we're finally beginning to face up to that. So I have no idea how the political system is going to respond to this, to the current problem, Bob. I look forward to hearing about it, reading about it. I'm not privy to what the governor-elect is planning on doing. I have said, I've been asked by the press repeatedly about this, and I said, I don't know. But one of the reasons that the recommendations that Tom generously referred to that I made last March included a recommendation that the state fiscal year be moved from March 31st to June 30th. And one of the many reasons for that was, how the hell can a guy get elected governor and 1 month later come up with a budget which represents essentially at least 2/3 of what a governor has to do in governing the state? Kind of silly. So I think we owe it to the governor-elect to wait until February 1st and see what his plan is. There's a lot of gossip, and if he hasn't made up his mind on everything, I would respect him even more, because it's a very tough, painful decisions.
You referred a few moments ago to the role of organized labor in looking at the current problems facing the state. You have been a good friend of organized labor, have chaired the AFL-CIO's Housing Investment Trust. What would you say to rank and file union members who believe deeply in the labor movement and are also concerned about the future of the state?
I would say that you, like all the rest of us, are going to have to recognize that we cannot fulfill all of the obligations that we incurred without consequences that will rip this society apart. So you too are going to have to put some skin into the game. And how and what, I think, is a subject of negotiation. that's not right or wrong for me to say what they ought to give up is not relevant in what should be a negotiation between all the people who care about the outcome. But I would say you certainly have to worry about the future and not assume that you're going to be able to protect everything that you've got. That's not only would I say it, I've said it to them. I tried to persuade them last year to support my plan. I met with them all. We had a terrific conversation. I'm not their enemy, and they recognize that. But they didn't. There's always been enough cash to get through the next year. So why all of a sudden should they undertake to support the kind of limits I proposed on budget balancing? There was no reason for them to do it. Any more than the banks wouldn't support it either. Because why should they limit their ability to facilitate the borrowing of money? That's how they earn their living. So that's why I said in the very beginning, nobody's behavior changed yet.
Somewhat related to that, New York and other states face big challenges in implementing healthcare reform, dealing with other issues that may not be addressed in Washington, whether they relate to energy or the environment or others. And we know that we are seeing something of a brain drain at the state level and I think in other states. How can states going forward get the best and brightest people to be interested in working on the nation's most important domestic priorities in state governments?
Well, one place to begin is if we could get our most august journalistic enterprises in the state to have a better balance between the number of column inches that they wrote about Hiram Montserrat and Peter Spada versus the New York budget. That would be a good beginning.
Let me go back to what you were saying about the future of the state's economy. You have played an extraordinary role in helping build and keep a powerful economic engine for the state in New York City and the downstate area generally. Where do you see the upstate economy going, let's say, over the next decade?
You know, I was absolutely appalled. I went upstate several times, and I read about it, but until you see the devastation in these upstate cities, you don't realize how the Rust Belt, if you want to call it that, but how American industry has been absolutely devastated. And it's also interesting to note that in several of our upstate cities, the most thriving enterprise is the State University. But very few examples. There are some. GE has a wind turbine facility that recently opened up. I had the fun of presiding over the dedication. Rensselaer has done some exciting things. There are a few examples. But this is the problem of the country. This is why I believe that the economy of this country has been declining for a long, long time because of the competition in Asia. Their ability to produce goods at a much, much cheaper cost because they have infrastructures that can transport these goods that are increasing in efficiency, whereas our infrastructure is diminishing at a serious rate in its capacity to move people and goods. And that deterioration, of which upstate is really a metaphor or a symbol of what's happened to our industrial economy in this country, it was masked by the credit bubble that started in the 90s. Money was cheap. People could borrow money to buy houses, to buy cars, to buy food. Money was very cheap. And therefore, despite the fact that the productive capacity of the United States was diminishing, there was nonetheless no perceived problem or crisis until the credit bubble itself burst in 2008. Then all of a sudden, it exposed all of the oozing sores of 20-odd years of loss of competitive position in the world markets. And just as we have a tax system in New York State that's geared to an industrial economy, as we have been moving rapidly towards a service economy, I mean, we have to adjust on a lot of things in order to have a chance to start over again. And I believe we can do it. I mean, I know this sounds corny, but I got great faith in the DNA of the United States.
That's good to hear. Let me talk a little bit more about upstate, if we may. A lot of people upstate believe that one cause of the budget problems is that they send a lot of money downstate, which of course is precisely the opposite of what the reality is. As you know, upstate gets a lot more money from our state budget than it pays. But there's also the issue of the different political attitude, if you will, between upstate and downstate. Some people in upstate make the case that what might be good public policy choices for downstate might not be the best public policy choices for upstate. Do you perceive that to be a problem?
You know, Bob, obviously you know this as well, if not better than I do. I can hear Pat Moynihan saying the same thing about the state of New York and Washington, D.C. He used to love to put out numbers every year about how much taxes New York sends to Washington and how little we get back. You know, it's funny. I spent some time the other day with the man who founded this institute and who created he worked with Dick Nathan, I'm talking about, worked with Pat Moynihan in the White House in the early 70s and got Nixon to recognize, interesting enough, a conservative Republican president to recognize that federal government was probably a more efficient tax collector than states were, and we had a general revenue sharing plan, in which the federal government gave money to states in accordance with formulas that bore a reasonable relationship to things like population, poverty, etc. That whole concept just sort of evanesced in these wild and woolly days in the 90s when everybody thought trees were growing in the sky. We have underlying everything that we're talking about. We have a fundamental question about what the future of federalism is in the United States. You know, it's very interesting. You talk about what states are responsible for doing, and you forget that under the Constitution of the United States of America, under the interpretation or intentions of its authors, states have primary responsibility for public safety, for education, for the state's infrastructure, for health care to the extent that it is the state that licenses hospitals and doctors. Those were explicitly not responsibilities of the federal government. And the federal government took a lot of those responsibilities because of the fact that it had a much broader and wider tax base, and because the politics in the United States pushed it in that direction. And I'm not saying either good or bad, obviously. I believe in a lot of the programs that were established. But what also happened in the process was that states were being proffered programs like Medicaid, and it's very hard to turn it down. It's a state option, Medicaid. When Lyndon Johnson proposed Medicare in 1965, he didn't include anything called Medicaid. He was concerned about providing health care for the elderly. That was a 100% funded federal program. Nobody spent a lot of time thinking what the out-year cost might be, but that's a separate question. But Medicaid got appended to it, in no small part because Nelson Rockefeller was an enemy of the idea. And now we have something in New York State that costs $52 billion. One about every 4 New Yorkers are benefit from the Medicaid program. And it's very nice for everybody who benefits. But how do we afford it? What is the responsibility? Should that be a federal responsibility too? 40% of the Medicaid money in New York State is spent on people who are already on Medicare. But if they need long-term care or a whole series of services that Medicare doesn't provide, they have to go to Medicaid to get that. Should that be a federal responsibility? You have, I'm trying to say this in a way that is unbiased. You have the federal government putting up $5 billion to incentivize states to transform their education system to something that a few people think is the right way to educate, other people don't agree, and it is not demonstrably clear who's right. But we're spending $5 billion at a federal level to bribe states to do what the Secretary of Education wants. Now, is that federalism? Is it right to say to a group of locally elected officials, you get money if you do it our way? Well, if they could do that, why don't they say, for example, you want our money, we'll give you a financial incentive if you impose a tax on gasoline that would enable you to generate enough revenue to support a sensible infrastructure program so that your highways and bridges, public transportation system, don't go to a hell in a basket. Well, why is the federal government interested in providing $5 billion incentive to change the education system, but nothing to change anything else in the way it works? I'm just picking a few illustrations, Bob, to say that that's one of the interesting issues that's going to emerge of all this. What is the responsibility of the state, the states versus the federal government? But then the next question is, what about states and local governments? Local governments are the creature statutorily of states, whether you're county or constitutional or statutory creations. So what happens when you say, when I suggested that the state ought to absorb the administration of the Medicaid program and not leave it to all the counties to administer separately, I also said that the state, though they couldn't afford it now, ultimately had to get to the point where it picked up all the costs so that the local share would diminish. All the county execs, they love the idea of the state picking up the cost, but they hated the idea of losing all the political clout and patronage associated with running the Medicaid program in their own respective counties. Now you have an interesting situation. What governors are doing around the country is they're trying to shift programmatic expenditures from the state level down to local government level to reduce state budgets. The only problem with that is that municipal governments have the same constraints on their financial resources and the politics of those cities. Just look at what does New York City spend a year in cash for health care benefits for cops, firemen, and sanitation men, over $1 billion a year in cash on health benefits until they reach, from the time of their retirement, which can be in their 40s, until they are eligible for Medicare at 65. The city of New York pays out over $1.1 billion, I think. Is that correct, in cash health care benefits? So states are not unlimited, cities are not unlimited, and counties are not ask the Nassau County exec what they think. So on the one hand, they want a property tax cap. On the other hand, I don't know how they're going to meet their statutory obligations, let alone all of their social obligations, if they can't raise property taxes. So that's where you're going to see, Bob, and I'm sorry for a long-winded answer, but that's where you're going to see this drama play out first. It's the conflict between local government and state government.
You mentioned a few moments ago something that's very close to your heart, infrastructure. Here up here, north of here, in the Adirondacks, we have a significant bridge that we tore down before it fell apart of its own. You are intimately familiar.
Like Champlain.
Yes. You are intimately familiar with what happened to the downstate transit system when it was neglected some years ago. Some people are concerned that some of those troubling lack of investments and lack of maintenance are starting to occur again. You threw out one idea that I don't think you were suggesting seriously for the federal government to force us to find a way to fund infrastructure, although maybe it was. But what is the most appropriate and plausible way forward for dealing with our infrastructure needs?
You know, it's interesting. There would be, but for this terribly fractious, unpleasant political atmosphere we're all functioning, there was and could have been built, if a president wanted to, a serious, powerful political constituency that would have supported revenue streams to support, to finance the modernization of America's infrastructure. I can tell you that the head of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, who I had many discussions on this subject with before 2008, would have gladly supported a gas tax to help finance the transportation infrastructure of the United States. So there was a common ground between business and labor. It requires extraordinary presidential leadership, and it's hard to do in a political atmosphere that has more acrimony than collegiality.
Okay. Well, coming back to the state level, one way that the governor-elect has talked about and some others have talked about in terms of finding a way to address our serious challenges is constitutional reform. He has talked about a constitutional commission of experts and leaders that would propose changes to the Constitution and lay the groundwork for a constitutional convention. You have talked about some of the fiscal reforms that might be needed. Do you want to talk more about those, or are there other constitutional changes that you think should be addressed?
Look, I can think of a lot of changes I'd like to see in the New York State Constitution. But I can think of a lot of changes that other people would want with equal passion that I would think would be disastrous. So therefore, I'm guided by the old principle of be careful what you wish for. And think about it, who's going to get elected to a constitutional convention? And who's going to spend money electing people as delegates to that convention? And what will their goals be? To advance the causes that I believe in? I'm not sure whether, in fact, that would be their agenda, given the fact that I am so concerned with having some kind of structural balance in our government. And I think under the existing Constitution, we have the tools to get there if we had the political will to get there. And as far as constitutional changes that have nothing to do with our fiscal sanity, I haven't thought about that for a long time, really, which doesn't mean I don't think there aren't possible good changes. I've been so preoccupied with the fisc, I haven't thought about some of the other things.
Okay. We talked talked a few moments ago about young people, and you mentioned your grandchildren. You've held influential positions in government, in private business, in the nonprofit sector. You've run for elected office. What would you say to young people who may think about running for office or working in government generally, and what would you say to them about the private sector?
Well, believe me when I say that every young person who has come to me for career advice, who has any glimmer of an interest in public things, I urge to get involved in public service. And I urge people to run for office. I ran for mayor, and it was a ridiculous candidate. And it's Ed Koch, against whom I ran, reminded me at the breakfast last week how the hell he remembered this and must really stick in his craw, but he said, you only got 3.1% of the vote. Which I think was accurate, but he remembered the percentage better than others. We're good friends. Right, no, we're good friends. I urge people to do it. It's one of the reasons we desperately need to have a system of public campaign financing. So it's possible for people who don't have money or are not willing to do the things they have to do to raise money. Any of the politicians or elected officials that I've gotten to know well personally, they all hate the fundraising. I mean, it's no secret that I had something to do with Pat Moynihan running for the Senate in '76, and I raised money for him. He hated to raise money. He hated to ask people for money. He intensely disliked it. We'd give him a list of phone calls to make, and he'd curse and avoid it for days and tell him, can't pay for next week's television commercials. You got no choice. He'd reluctantly do it and be angry at me for suggesting it. I mean, but I would encourage people to do it. I mean, I think, for the same reason that so many people get involved in community activities or charitable enterprises, it's one of the great things about this country. We do care about our neighbors. And the only way you can make the world a better place is if there's enough talent in the public end. So as I said before, the press has got to stop treating people as if they're taking advantage of the public. And there has to be some appreciation. When I was a kid, just starting out business and civic life in New York City, if I was in the presence of a commissioner of the Department of the City of New York, boy, I was very respectful. I called him or her commissioner and treated them. I was educated to believe they were very, very important people. If you see the way that the average public official is treated in the media and by the public, and they're related, it's dreadful. What are the incentives for people to do public service? It's obviously not a way to make a lot of money. So there's got to be a lot of satisfaction, and there's got to be some sense of reward for recognition of implicit, if not explicit, thanks from the public for devoting your talent, such as it may be, to that. I taught up at the Kennedy School for the year after I finished my term as chairman of the MTA. I taught a course on the difference between running an enterprise in the public sector and running one in the private sector. Well, I'm sorry to tell you that at the Kennedy School of Government, over half of the people in my class wanted jobs in the private sector. Because the rewards were enormous. And I don't know if anybody studied this, but the incentives to be in the financial world, where no question one does a lot of good things by financing a lot of enterprises, but you also do a lot of things just moving money around from one pocket to another, and it doesn't necessarily, I mean, it create jobs in a financial center like New York City, but it doesn't necessarily have that significant effect on the economy as a whole. But these were the incentives that our society proffered. And just look at the disparity of compensation. Look, fundamentally look at it in the country. I think, what, 1/10 of 1% of the people in the United States earn 25% of the wealth. I mean, that's a staggering change over the last 25 years. But look at the gap between private compensation and public compensation. Again, the same reasons. It's not quite as dramatic as it may seem to be, the basic compensation level. I do not know, and I respectfully don't think anybody knows, whether or not the salary of a teacher, for example, is the sole determinative thing as to whether that individual is going to engage in the teaching profession. I'm not sure the answer to that. But I don't think people become teachers if they're primarily concerned about how to make the most amount of money. And most teachers are fairly well educated. So there's partially a passion for teaching, partially a concern about the public weal, and obviously also the fact that anybody in public service has traditionally, until probably the future, been able to enjoy a package of long-term healthcare benefits and pension entitlements.
Do you subscribe to the argument that we should change the pension system?
Yes. Well, I think what I would do is I would, let's separate it out. First of all, any change you make for future employees is not going to have any short-term impact because we're not hiring, we're firing. But I would certainly create a whole different system for the future. And I would preferably go for a system in which private enterprise is almost unanimously willing to, which is to move from defined benefit plans to defined contribution plans. On the other hand, I think there has to be some minimal amount of money that people will have to live on, and that ties into what happens to Social Security as well, and how those two are related. So it's a national problem. It doesn't mean that states aren't going to handle it individually, but it's a social problem because I think everybody in this room probably knows. I mean, one of the reasons pensions is so underfunded is when interest rates drop, the trustees, in order to try to meet the return estimates that they predicated their payments on to remain actuarially sound, they couldn't meet that by being in the debt market, by investing conservatively. So they started giving pension funds to the equity swingers in this world, expecting a higher return. And that didn't work out either particularly well, to say the least. And consequently, their rate of return expectations were almost unanimously defeated. And that's, we have a mammoth problem, not just for public employees, we have it for private employees also. You have people in the construction industry who are the beneficiaries of Taft-Hartley plans that are reportedly substantially underfunded. People on the Hill will tell you that the Pension Benefit Guarantee Board, which is the way pension benefits are guaranteed under our federal law, they have serious, they don't have the financial resources to meet all their obligations. You just saw 48-hour stories about the unemployment benefits running out in this country, which is absolutely true. What you don't read is that the state of New York owes the federal unemployment insurance fund $3.2 billion. And I don't know whether this is going to be part of the statutory change that's going through the Congress this week. But I can tell you, under the laws that exist yesterday, the state has to start repaying that on January 1st. They're not going to pay for it through an appropriation. They're going to pay for it by imposing a greater insurance premium upon all the employers in New York. And they won't call it a tax. It's exactly the same as a tax. So, you know, you can duck, you can defer, but you cannot avoid paying for things that you've committed dollars to in the past. It generally proves to be more expensive by deferring it and more painful by deferring it than facing up to it when you make the commitment to begin with.
Let me go back, if I could, to Mayor Koch, whom you mentioned, when he was not teasing you about your 3.1% in the campaign.
Right.
He had some wonderful things to say about you, including describing you as the guy who produces results. What results so far give you the most satisfaction?
Well, I want to choose my words carefully, seeing some distinguished members of the Fourth Estate. But the truth of the matter is, I don't feel I accomplished anything very substantive. I think that I've hopefully enhanced the public dialogue on the subject. I've met enough members of the legislature to believe there's a lot of good there, as well as what you read about all the time. I wish there were better people in government generally. I understand the disincentives. I've shared vicariously the pain that a lot of the good people in government feel when their ideas are ignored, like Pete Gravis was fired, and I've seen the very talented people who run the budget division try very hard to get the political system to focus on all of the consequences of what they do and not just the ones they intend. And I've shared some of their frustrations. But in fairness, and I may have failed to do some of the things that I might have done, but the truth is, lieutenant governors don't have functions to perform other than presiding over the Senate. And that, thank God, was purely voluntary. It was not a source of serious public discussion, to say the least. It actually was occasionally a source of some humor. That's not what it was intended to be. But so, in that sense, I don't feel I failed to do something the law required me to do. The stated reason that Governor Patterson asked me to do this was both because the next in line, the succession at that point, I think was Peter Spada, and people were rapidly somewhat concerned about that possibility. So he thought he ought to get somebody else in the line of succession. But the stated reason why he picked me was because I'd had this experience with fiscal crises, when all I could do was offer my recommendations, and they were rejected by the governor and by the attorney general at the time.
Some of them, not all of them, if I recall.
Well, they're all interrelated. I don't think they're meaningful unless they're a package. I have no idea why. There were substantive discussion. I had very substantial discussions with the leadership of the Assembly and with the very talented staff of the Assembly. And I talked to some of the staff people in the Senate about it as well. And I think I talked to probably, if not all, over half of the members of the Senate individually about my plan. And I was struck by how many people thought it was the right idea, but told me I was politically naive. How the Republicans just had decided they were going to oppose everything. Didn't matter whether it was right or wrong. But over half of them told me privately it was a good idea. So maybe they'll revive it then and they can probably see the difference.
Well, let me just point out that you did persuade people that we ought to change our budgeting system to more accurately reflect the expenses that we're incurring in a given year, and you certainly had an enormous impact on the debate, but I won't argue with you further about that. Let me instead ask you, what are you looking forward most to doing after you leave office?
Well, first of all, my wife has been incredibly thoughtful and a good sport about telephone ringing late at night and the trips to Albany, etc. So I'm going to take her away for a week of music and art. And then I'm really looking forward to, I've gotten so fascinated with this subject that I'm going to stick with it exactly in what form I don't know. But I do intend to write and lecture and talk and research